Welcome to Mission Ignition, the new leadership development podcast from Catalyzer and Catalyzer Media, organized to introduce you to our team and our approach to igniting leadership growth in your organization. I'm Steve Ingalls, President, CEO at Catalyzer, and we're excited to share another episode with you. I'm excited to come to you here from Broomfield, Colorado. For those of you maybe not familiar with the Metro Denver area, Broomfield sits just north of downtown, about 15 miles. It's due north of Golden and just at the eastern base of the Rocky Mountains. So been a beautiful day, a beautiful week here this week with the county sheriffs of Colorado. And here we are back with another exciting edition of Mission Ignition. One of the things that we're keen to use this platform to help do is to introduce our team to the universe. As I was telling John before we started this, I get plenty of FaceTime with the world, but this team that really makes this company grow and go does not. And so I'm excited to welcome Jon Smidt. John, are you sitting in Ultiwa today? And I probably said it wrong.
No, it is. That's right. And like you, I'm near the mountains, except these are the foothills of the Appalachians here. And I'm just northeast of Chattanooga.
Okay. John, we were just chatting about this as well. John joined us on August 5th of 2015, which makes him an over 9-year veteran. We have a team that's about a 15-year cohort, then we have a team that's around a 7 to 9-year cohort, and then we have a team, pretty significant size of the team now that's under a couple of years. So there's really 3 bands of our folks. John is a longtime friend of mine that we engaged while he was working in northern Alabama in the Birmingham area after he retired from the military. But John, if you wouldn't mind, could you talk to us a little bit about what you do for Catalyzer?
I think I do 3 different things. The first is I'm a facilitator, which means that I host discussions with organizations about leadership topics. And those might be familiar leadership topics, like something like communication, or they may be something that they've never discussed before, like emotional intelligence. And the hope is that it's all instructive and productive and illuminating, so that even if it's something like communication, we come at it from a new perspective, a different angle to help highlight some new thoughts for people. And certainly in a case like emotional intelligence, it's to really pry their minds open. And, that works best when we get out of the way and kind of uncork the champagne bottle and release the latent wisdom in a room that kind of bubbles over. Because that type of learning, people take ownership of when it's their own ideas and their own experiences and their own insights.
You just described some of the differentiators that I think that Catalyzer brings to the universe. How have you found Catalyzer in comparison to all of the other leadership experiences that you've encountered, the formal and informal? How would you tell people that we're legitimately different?
I think that we really do release the wisdom that's in the room. It's not like we show up with all the answers, but I think we bring good questions and we help people discover what's important to them and then come alongside them and help them find the pathways that are going to take them where they want to go.
In those 9 years, what's your favorite Catalyzer story?
There's a guy in Alabama named Kenneth. And, one of the things we do is when we come back after an absence of a few weeks or even a couple months, we follow up and say, based on what we talked about last time, what have your experiences been? And there was a time we talked about emotional intelligence and we came back to follow up. And so this guy Kenneth said, yeah, my guys tell me I'm doing a better job listening, being more present. And he said, but the real news is that my daughter pulled me aside and said, Daddy, now I can talk to you. And I know that Utility Trailer Corporation, manufacturing didn't hire us for Kenneth's daughter, but I think it's kind of an inevitable result of the things we talk about, that people carry that learning into their personal lives. And it's an enrichment of a person as a whole, not just in a specific sphere of their life. So I think that speaks more broadly to what we offer people.
I alluded to the fact that you and I have known each other for a while, and very specifically, we met outside a small pine forest that had an obstacle course in it on what I remember to be warm March afternoon in 1983. Talk a little bit about the relationship that you and I have had. I have my own memories of this, but again, I really be interested in your perspective on here we are 41 years later.
Well, back then, of course, the unifying feature was we were both in the same flight school class. Although we inhabited different parts of that, you were at the top of the class, I was firmly in the middle. But, that's extended far beyond that. And I mean far intellectually and far physically, because after flight school, we both went to Germany. We served there, in different units, and we didn't have much to do with each other during that period. But, it continued. We came back to the States. We went to grad school at the same time. You were at Georgia Tech. I was at Northwestern. Then we went to West Point, and we were teaching at the same time. You were teaching aerospace engineering. I was teaching English. After that, we went to Command and General Staff College in Kansas for a year. And then after that, what I think one of the more profound experiences of my career, and I think both our careers, was being in the 2nd Infantry Division, standing against communist North Korea. And it was you who were the first person on the scene after I was in a helicopter crash with my boss. So that was a profound moment. And, I think after Korea, I'm not sure we saw each other for maybe 5 years or so until you had finished your battalion command. I was back at West Point. You came through. That was another intense experience, conversation. And then from there, you have to fast forward, like you've already mentioned, all the way to 2015. So I would say periods of intensity interrupted by sometimes years of not being in contact. And then, these past 9 years have been incredibly fulfilling, enriching period of growth and change. I'm especially grateful for that. And if I could, I'd like to say, the second thing that I do for Catalyzer is coaching. And when I say coaching, I'm talking about that process of helping people discover what's important to them, and then helping identify the paths that they think are important and productive that are going to get them where they want to go. And then trying to hold them accountable to that, help them commit to those things that they say are important and actually achieve them. And then the third thing that's been going on over these past few months, I guess, is plant visits. And one of the things that has really struck me about plant visits is how, and this is, when you talk about some of the unique features of what we do, I think this is a particularly good example of how we can come into an organization where we may not be the experts. We're not the experts on building trailers or pouring precast concrete. And yet there are some things we can see physically, whether plants clean, whether processes are working well, whether people work well together, whether things are proceeding safely. And then there are a lot of things that are unseen, and we only find those things out by talking with people. And I would say that for sure, frequently, it feels like always, almost always for sure, people open up to us in a way they don't with their own leaders. And so we find out things that are often news to them. And there could be any number of reasons for that. It could be that they don't ask. It could be that they don't listen. It might be that there's not a safe space, physically or emotionally. And then there's one really paradoxical thing that happens, and that is where you have leaders who say they want feedback, and yet inadvertently they shut it down. And that's a space that we can kind of wedge into and help explore that and hopefully fix that. So I see that as a particular strength of our organization.
I'll just mention for those listening, you didn't show up when I crashed my helicopter.
And for those listening, I was a hemisphere away at the time.
Okay, fair enough. I've always, Jon, found your personal and professional journey really fascinating. You were newly married. It was a big deal back in the day. And, in 1983, when we met you, you had married Joyce in January when the balance of us were largely getting married in that summer following, whatever year it was. 1982 is when I was married to Kara. So for whatever reason, that 6-month head start seemed to have a lot to do with how, I don't know how good or bad a husband we were, but we were still figuring it out. You had 6 months under your belt, and then you had this personal journey that included a large family, now just rich with grandchildren and extended family through the spouses of your children. Talk about your personal journey first, and then we'll get to professional here in a minute.
I came from Midwestern parents, and my dad was an Army chaplain. Before that, he had been a pastor for 7 years before he went in the Army. But once he went in the Army, we moved around. So I actually lived 7 years in Oregon as a kid. And then next to that, it was 5 years in Germany. And those are the two places I lived the longest. During that time, I started out playing piano. I played piano before I ever played sports. But I think, as with a lot of young guys, sports really brought me out of my shell and gave me confidence. And yet I hearken back to a lot of what you get from practicing piano as a skill that's fundamental to so much else in life, to come across things that are new and difficult and having to dig in to figure out how to do it and then practice it over and over, even, because that's no fun, doing the hard stuff, but that's how you get better. I was able to play sports in college. I'm not a big guy. There's most of a foot in height between us. That's what Division III is all about, small college. I ran track and played football and had a good experience with that. And that too carried forward to help me professionally. You alluded to the richest part of my life. I try not to take this for granted, but my dad died at 50 of a heart attack, and his dad died at 55. So if you follow that math, I was probably due to die at 45, but I had a lot better medical care and I had a lot better insight into my own health. And so now I'm almost 65. I'm very grateful that throughout all those years, we've been able to raise 6 kids. And there's now 6 grandkids. 4 of our kids are married. All of them are through college. The other thing I think I want to say about that, well, 2 of our kids have their master's degree already, and 1 is halfway through hers. And, that's something I actually credit the military for. Not because they've all got their educations through the military, but I think it was the military that showed me the value of education, who paid for my undergraduate and graduate degrees. That kind of colors everything as you move forward, what you want for your own children. And I didn't mention that my wife, Joyce, retired from the reserve. She was active duty when we met. One thing I didn't mention is during our first year of marriage, I was studying in Germany. There were about 10 months during our first year of marriage when we weren't living together. That was hard. As with so many other things, it's the difficult times that help temper and shape and grow you. I think that's part of the strength that has carried us through in all the years since. Oh, I remember
a little bit about your military career. From we've already ascertained you started off as an Army aviation officer. Well, back in those days, we were not aviation officers when we were in flight school. We were carrying a different branch, but that's a minor technical detail.
Yeah.
You went to Germany, you did all of that, but you had some really interesting kind of sideways things that you did along the way. What comes to mind maybe is the professional time that you spent at Fort Leavenworth, and then when you went back to the military academy at West Point the second time. Talk briefly about both of those, if you would.
Well, first of all, even my aviation experience was a little different in that I worked a lot in air traffic control and air traffic services instead of, just straight piloting, which a lot of young guys do. So that was different. But you're right. The grad school experience in English shaped the rest of my career. Not only did that get me the teaching job at West Point, but after coming back from Korea when I was teaching at Command and General Staff College, writing program was inside the leadership department. And so I wound up teaching leadership. From there, the combination of leadership experience and writing background got me a job working on the Army's leadership manual. And once we got that published, I then moved over and became the managing editor of the Army's professional journal, Military Review. So that whole writing background really carried forward, kind of concluding with a repeat tour back to West Point. I worked in the English department another couple of years. And then I had the most fascinating job of my career because I became the executive officer for the commanding general, a 3-star general. At the time, he was the number 9 guy in the whole Army. And I got to see leadership from a level that I had never imagined. And I learned up front personally what we had talked about in the leadership manual process, that at that level, ironically, you don't have the amount of authority that you might at a lower level. A lot of your communication, a lot of your interaction is with people outside your organization who don't fall under you. And so you have to become skilled at negotiation and compromise and persuasion and listening and networking and a bunch of other things that you typically just don't learn. So I think, again, that's one of the things that we in Catalyzer bring to organizations is an awareness of those types of skills that are important that people often either discount or disregard altogether. And then my last job at West Point was working in the athletic department, which was like the Wild West, because you come from a very strict environment within the military working for the government. There's specific rules about how you handle money. And then you get into an organization where there's ticket money and apparel money and donations and non-appropriated funds. It was crazy, but it was also mind expanding. So I'm grateful for that experience as well.
Out of all those experiences, I can't help but imagine you got a couple of war stories that make sense. What are your favorite leadership war stories?
When I first came to the soup's office, the soup is a superintendent at West Point, there was this big fiasco about having a statue of Red Blake being commissioned and put on West Point. And the idea was to inscribe the names of all the players back from the class of 51 to include 70 players who had been kicked out of West Point for cheating. And there was, for months, there was this enormous debate on email. I had the soup's email account, so I saw everything that people were sending him. And frequently I would read his emails before he got into work. And so I knew what people were saying, and he just wouldn't engage. He wouldn't take a side. And to me, it was very clear that statue cannot come to West Point with the names of people who were kicked out for cheating. I thought that was so obvious.
Tell people who Red Blake was.
Red Blake was, I think, probably the most famous football coach in West Point history. Incredibly successful, not just in football, but, in the character of the officers that were developed under his tutelage. So he understood what West Point was about. He was able to parlay that understanding into both good football teams and great young officers. Anyway, by the time this was all over, these guys had gotten sick of trying to get a rise out of General Lennox, and they just wound up taking that statue and putting it at the College Football Hall of Fame. And it was a huge problem that really never happened because he refused to engage. And so for months, I thought he was being just not on top of things, as if he didn't really understand. But of course, I was the one who didn't understand. And so that was a huge lesson for me, that you don't have to have your hair on fire just because everybody else does. And you don't have to engage in somebody else's problem and make it your own.
If I had Dr. Doty on this podcast, Joe would start talking about mindfulness and emotional intelligence.
Right.
I, as you well know, have a bit of a burr under my saddle about performance reviews. Mm-hmm. I like talking about emotional intelligence and team building. What's your leadership thingy?
One of the things that I've been thinking about recently is this whole concept of accountability. We've got that book, How Did I Let That Happen, by Jon Smidt. And the big nugget in there is that when we talk about accountability, typically we're looking at a problem out there. There's something wrong with what our people are doing. And what they call us back to is the self-reflection, the self-investigation, the introspection that often reveals that the primary problem may have to do with us. We may not be clear in our own heads about what we want. We may not have communicated it well. We may not have ever explained why. And a lot of times we don't make sure that we're doing our part to make sure that we get what we think it is we want. And so when I think about that whole concept of accountability as a leadership problem, first with the leader and not first with the followers, it seems like a natural place where we, I think, are especially fine-tuned to interface with organizations and help those leaders discover first what it is they really want, and then second, investigate the processes to make sure that they're doing what they need to do to get what they want. Now, what that means is that the leaders have to first realize they need help. And, for some people, that's a hard thing to admit. They think they got to have all the answers. They think they have to do all the heavy lifting. And I think once they meet us, they realize that it doesn't have to be an adversarial thing. It doesn't have to be humiliating. It can be a partnership. I think that's borne out in what we see with our long-term relationships, in that companies retain us. Well, you got the stats. I don't. But I just know from my own experience, we've worked with some organizations for years and years, not just because we deliver good content, but because we develop deep relationships. Yep. And that carries over from our relationships with some of their leaders to their relationships within the organization. So I put that back as a form of accountability, where I start looking at myself first before I try to solve problems beyond myself.
A great lesson, Jon, for us all to remember from time to time. Among the modules that we facilitate for others, that's one of my favorites, because I do think that there's different way of looking at this somewhat troublesome subject, courtesy of Connors and Smith and their thinking on it. So, yeah, I appreciate more than you making the time to share a bit about Catalyzer, your journey with us, your journey as a father and a husband, and as a soldier. Wish I could say when we're going to see each other again next, but this is it for now. So I'm sure our paths will cross at some point pretty soon on down the road. Thanks for joining us on Mission Ignition. We hope you'll tune in again soon and make this one of your go-to sources for plain, practical thinking around the contemporary issues you, your leaders, and your organization are dealing with. In the meantime, please check us out on our website at www.teamcatalyzer.com and on LinkedIn. Remember, regardless of what business we're in, we're primarily in the people business. Now time to get out there and ignite some great.